So we start out uh, seeing the world, seeing so-called churches everywhere. Uh, we've talked about this so many times when we started our new church, and people would ask me, "Do we really need another church in this town?" Because if you look, there's church buildings everywhere, and they have the name Jesus on them. Why do we need to start a new one? And that's a really good question. And the truth is the answer is we shouldn't need to start a new one. The one that has the name on the building should be the one that everybody goes to. It should be biblical. And we know that that's not what happens. And we know that pastors are often chosen for outside appearing worldly reasons. They're chosen for outside appearing worldly reasons. We saw this initially with the King Saul, who was the first king of Israel, and he was a tall guy, tall, dark, and handsome guy. This Saul was, and then when they bring this little David guy along, and everybody said, "Oh, even Samuel said he's just kind of a little squirt," and God started actually priming the pump on leadership, saying He looks at the heart. He doesn't look at the things the way that the world looks at them. And we see that this is exactly what's going on today. Pastors are chosen, and I mean by chosen is not just that you all here happen to be taking a vote on a particular pastor, but you're at a church because you've chosen to be there and chosen to listen to that pastor. So this has to do with everybody here, and it really shows what kind of church you go to. It really does show what you really want to hear and how you really want to live and what you really don't want to hear. And so pastors today are often chosen for their relevance. I'll start with that word first because it's a buzzword now. Oh, this church is relevant. I like that guy because he has relevance. And relevance means he understands me. He understands the new stuff. He goes way beyond the old-fashioned stuff of the Bible. He knows the new concerns. But everybody that studies under the true teaching of the Bible, everybody in this room understands that, yeah, what he just said is relevant to me. How do I know that? Because it hurts. So the Bible's timeless, but these new guys want to say that, well, it's old fashioned, and so I have new revelation and new things to say that have to do with what you need for your life today, because the Bible's just old. And you guys, like I said, why don't people want to go to a church where they preach the truth? Because it hurts, and because it hurts, it proves it's relevant. Otherwise, they wouldn't leave. The whole reason they leave a church that preaches the truth is because it is relevant and it hurts and they don't want to hear it. And so we all know that. There's heads nodding everywhere. It's just so they're chosen for their relevance. They're chosen for their looks. How about this one? Their charisma. And I'm not necessarily talking about being charismatic in their theology, but just their charisma or their social status. They're chosen for that. They're chosen for their ability to have everybody just get along. Oh, that's a good leader. He makes it so that everybody just gets along. He gets along with all the other pastors. Everybody's just living, and it's all nice. And the Bible calls this a false peace coming from these often chosen worldly pastors. These worldly pastors are the ones that will not address sin, nor will they address the often painful truth of the Bible because they don't want people to hurt. This is how pastors are chosen today. Why do I say that? Because they have more people in their churches. Let's just say that. So what we're saying here is the majority of so-called Christians are choosing these pastors, and they're choosing them for this reason. And so that's the way that the worldly people choose their pastors. But as we talked about with Saul and David, a pastor is not dealing with the seen concerns of the world, but a pastor actually deals with the invisible spiritual forces of darkness we see in Ephesians 6:12. A real pastor doesn't deal with everybody's so-called relevant and important issues. A true pastor deals with the really ugly stuff that's invisible. And the only way to combat those things is by the truth. And so you have two different realms, the worldly realm of a church or the spiritual realm of a church. It's just black and white. You can't deny it. With this, then, a pastor must lead his people into the battles of spiritual warfare on the front lines. Because at the end of the day, I could preach all these fun things and remind you of all these fun things that we can do on a particular evening. And all get together and go, wow, that was really fun. But then you go home and you go, but I still have this issue. And I don't even know if I can even tell anybody about it, but this is haunting me. A real pastor wants to address those things. You got to get this part. He must live as a dedicated soldier of the truth against the attacks of lies and sin, especially his own sin. He must hate sin, and he must be zealous to fight against the falsehood and the lies, and be zealous for the truth. Ephesians 6:10-18. He must be able to endure suffering, stay alert, and be devoted to Christ, the commander-in-chief. As a soldier, 2 Timothy 3:4. So a real pastor needs to be on the front lines with other men to deal with the spiritual things, to deal with the truth, to not allow the falsehood to come in and get behind the front lines. It's a team that has to be solid without any weak link on the team. That's why, as we'll see this, that we need men, plural. There's not one guy on the front line. It doesn't work that way because you can get around the one guy. But we need men arm in arm marching forward and protecting everyone behind us. And if we have a guy that's weak or something, as we get into this later on, something that the rest of us don't know about, and all of a sudden there's a hole and the whole line is collapsed because what happened to that guy? That's why we have these biblical qualifications for leaders, and it's so important we pay attention. So the Bible gives us what is necessary in selection of such leaders. And we know that such leaders does not necessarily mean the title of elder or pastor. It means men initially. And we know that it still does trickle downhill for the women's leadership in leading other women and leading children. So everybody here needs to see these things. So in this passage this morning, Titus chapter 1, verse 5 and 6 lists 3 pastor qualifications that will help you to recognize, follow, and or be one. So let's read Titus 1, 5 and 6. For this reason, Paul is saying to Titus, I left you in Crete that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. Namely, if any man is beyond reproach, the husband of one wife, having faithful children who are not accused of dissipation or rebellious. And that's what we see in this first section of elder qualifications. So with this, Paul had set up a series of church plants on the island of Crete, which is in the Mediterranean Sea. He had appointed one of his sons of the faith, Titus. We know that Timothy was another son in the faith, and he appointed him to oversee these churches, which meant Paul considered Titus to be one that follows these and is one of these men. So we can see that. And Titus himself, which is really scary, he was not only responsible for setting up men in his own one church, but a whole bunch of churches. And as we can see, he had a very difficult job because of the requirements. How is he going to pay attention to, first of all, the men in his own church, but then the men over in that church and the men over in that church is a big deal. But it's the qualifications that are relevant today. So we are relevant because the Bible's relevant. With this, he was supposed to establish elders in each church, which means the church is supposed to have several men as elders, plural, in each church. That's the goal. We know that it takes a while with a church plant. We're just learning this right now. Paul is saying now to complete the church, these are the things that need to happen. So that's where we are. We're working on these same things as we speak. And so last time we saw the apostles' model of a godly leader. We saw a description that Paul made about himself last week in the very beginning of this passage also. And we see then that we saw that Paul's own understanding about his person was what needed to happen. A godly leader understands his person, in other words, who he is and his position. He understands his purpose, which was to evangelize the justification, uh, edify for the sake of sanctification, and encourage our glorification. Guys, we're going to make it to the finish line as Christians. That's what a godly leader's purpose is. And then his process of this is through preaching. And even now, you're exposed to preaching. As I get ready to present the preaching, I'm exposed to preaching. And when you go home, you're actually leading your family in preaching. So all of us are in this chain of being preached to and then preaching. And like I said, this really does trickle down even to the women. It's just the way that it is. So he describes these understandings as to what every godly leader must have generally. In other words, you must know this yourself, who you are and who you're supposed to be. And then right now we're going to get into the specifics on his particular role as a leader. And so with this, we saw the general attitude or understanding that a godly leader has about himself as a humble servant, and yet in a privileged yet fearful position as a husband, father, elder, pastor. And we also see that his responsibility for them was to participate in them being saved, participating in them in being sanctified, and participating in encouraging them that their salvation is true and coming. Now, with this, he gets into this specific establishment of elders, and he says this, that you would appoint elders. And so with this, Paul's not necessarily telling Titus something that he hasn't told him before. He did tell him before. He says, as I've instructed you. But he's not bagging on Titus either. He's saying, now's the time, and it's supposed to be read to everyone. So when somebody wants to argue with Titus, Titus would say, hey, read the letter. This is what Paul says, so don't be all mad at me because I'm making these supposedly difficult qualifications. It's in writing now, it's in the Bible, and it's been passed down to us. And all of us as men are going to shake in our boots when we read these things, because our flesh does not provide these things. Only the Holy Spirit provides these qualifications. So all of us we're still struggling with the flesh. Of course you are. All of us are in this. But which direction are you going? And is there, first of all, is there movement? And is there movement going in the right direction? So like I said, all of us, and all of us includes me, we shake in our boots when we read what it says about what a godly man looks like. So before anybody gets all huffy, we're all in this together. And even the women that look at it and want to point at the men, and then at the same time, we're like, yeah, but he's actually supposed to be this way too as a leader of the women and children. So all of us just need to sit here and go, all right, what does it say? So that's what we're going to do. So with this, it's written authority, apostolic authority about this is just the way it is. This is the way Christ wants us to recognize and follow and even be a godly leader. These are instructions from Christ, and it's just the way it is. Therefore, we can see that this takes time and testing to establish these things. In the same way, if you ladies marry a man, you should pay attention and take a little time and testing to see what you're getting into with him. Therefore, 1 Timothy 3:8, as we read earlier, an elder cannot be a Christian for only a short time, because he might get cocky. We saw that. Nor one that had not been tested. 2 Corinthians 8:22, and we read earlier in 1 Timothy 10, that the men have to be tested. They have to take some time and be tested. And we saw that Paul was big on setting up elders. He did it elsewhere. Acts 14:21, Acts 20 or 17. And with this, it's nothing new to Paul. And we see that deacons and elders, both offices, are ordained offices, and they're recognizing men as being, and even women in the deaconess role, as being ordained by God, and they're officially in an official position because they've been recognized by leadership in that. And now Paul has instructed this to Titus, and he's instructing it to us. And with this, Paul focuses on the role of elder, but you don't have the permission to zone out because they're talking about elders now and you have no intention of ever being one. You know this has to do with everyone here. And with this, the term elder is used in the same context or synonym, basically, to a shepherd, a pastor, teacher, an overseer, a bishop, and a presbyter. All those terms basically point to an elder, and or a leader in a local church. And with this, as each of these synonyms would have, they have a specific nuance. And so the nuance for the term elder is describing a man who has maturity and dignity. Who has maturity and dignity is what we talk about as an elder. These are the ones who already lead by example. The ones that are chosen aren't like, okay, now you're going to get into this new job and you have to do this, this, and this. No, an elder is not necessarily chosen. He's one that's recognized as already doing it. He's the one that the other men in the church automatically go to because they can see that he's already doing it. So the way it should be is when an elder or deacon is selected, it's like it's a no-brainer to anybody. There shouldn't be any contesting it because everybody knows, yeah, he's been doing it for years. So it should be very easy. And with this, then, he must be leading by example, Philippians 3:17, 1 Thessalonians 2:7, and leading with integrity. Psalm 15:1 and 2 talks about that. So last time, as I said, we saw the understandings of a godly leader, what he has, his understanding about himself, his attitude, whatever the leadership role he's in. And this time we will see the qualifications of an elder. And we will see others. We're going to see 3 today, but we're going to see others in the next couple of weeks. So we're going to deal with 3 today. So we're going to see these 3 pastor qualifications that will help you to recognize, follow, and or be one. So the first one we see here is the overall qualification. This is easy to grasp, not easy to do. The overall qualification for an elder relating to general integrity, that all the other qualifications fall under this one. And the term is beyond reproach. The term is beyond reproach. And it goes along with this term, meaning it's the godly leader's reputation. That's the first point we have today. The very beginning of verse 6, 6a. Namely, if any man is beyond reproach. And above or beyond reproach means that he's blameless, unreprovable, innocent of all charges and accusations. In other words, you might not like him, but you have no dirt on him. That means above reproach. It means I don't have any dirt on him. I'm looking though. I don't like him. And we know that happens. Does that sound familiar? It happened with Christ. It happened with the apostles. They wanted to find. Did you notice that Jesus was constantly, he even says, knowing he was being tested, he answered them with this. And it even says that they were trying to test him. So all of us might not like a guy. And we know that there's times when I don't like that guy, but I'm not really sure why. Well, that might mean that he might not be above reproach. But there's also the case of those that I just don't like him, and so they make up false accusations. But it's a man who doesn't have anything provable. He's unreprovable, meaning you can't say to him, hey, you're doing this wrong. You might be able to say to him, I don't like your shoes, or you're ugly, but there's nothing that really matters that you can have against him. With this, as you guys know, a godly man will be accused, but must have no provable charges against him. He will be accused. Oh, that pastor's no good. He's getting accused for stuff all the time. Yeah. Just like our master. So, we see this then as we get in. This is an overarching qualification. We first then see this whole issue, which is a touchy, big deal that Paul lays out first, the godly leader's sexuality. Boom. First one right out of the chute, under the umbrella of being beyond reproach. It says here, verse 6b, the husband of one wife. So, what does that mean? The husband of one wife. I called it the point, the godly leader's sexuality, because we will see that that's Paul's point in all this. First of all, let's look at what this does not mean. Because this could be taken of all kinds of different ways. But this is what it does not mean. Which things that have been presented, oh, this means this, and no, it doesn't mean that. So we're going to go through some of these things so that when we leave here today, you won't say, yeah, but there's other guys that have said this, this, and this, and there's all kinds of views on that. So who do we believe? Well, by the time we're done, you're going to see, oh, yeah, this is obviously the point. First of all, what it does not mean as a qualification for elders, it does not mean that an elder must be married. Because you could take it as that guy can't be an elder because he's not married. You could take it as that. But we learn that Paul even was possibly, not only that, possibly an elder, but he was an apostle. In Acts 13:1, it talks about and indicates that Paul was actually an elder. And there's no mention anywhere of him having a wife. In fact, as we see later on in this message, that Paul had a gift of celibacy where he didn't need to have a wife. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But Paul was an elder, and he did not have a wife. It also does not mean that it does not mean a widower who has remarried. Oh, so now he's got two wives, so he's disqualified. That's not true. A widower can remarry. Romans 7:2-3, 1 Corinthians 7:39. A widower or a widow can remarry, and if they can be separated in the situation they were, then that automatically means that they can remarry. It does not mean either a man who was legitimately divorced. Why? Because Paul talks about that one who was legitimately divorced is no longer under bondage and therefore could remarry. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 7:15. So it can't mean that a man had been a widower and remarried or was legitimately divorced or remarried. It can't mean that. So what does it mean? Well, the term's easy. Back then, everybody understood what it meant. A husband, it means a husband of one wife. It means that, well, let me back up. We'll explain it in a little bit more in a second, but it basically means a one-woman man. We're going to see that. That's basically what it meant to them back then. And as we go through what it does not mean, we can see that that's what it points to. But let's see what it does mean, just to clarify everything. It does mean that an elder cannot be a man with several wives. We know that polygamy is against the Bible. And you say, well, Solomon had a bunch of wives and David had a bunch of wives. They weren't supposed to. The Bible even mentioned it specifically for kings not to do that. It was considered adultery. So it's against the rules. We already know that. So we know that it can't be a man that has several wives waltzing in here saying he wants to be an elder and he's got several wives. But like we said, an elder must be a one-woman man, meaning not known for sexual interest for other women. That's what this means. And it means not interest for other women, meaning physical adultery, as everybody knows. Exodus 20:14, it started out. Matthew 5:27, Jesus reaffirmed that. And Jesus not only reaffirmed that, but verified that it cannot even be mental or emotional adultery. That it's just as guilty. It's called adultery. Matthew 27:28. And with this, in all of this, a godly leader is to portray the relationship of Christ and the church in his marriage. His marriage should demonstrate the gospel. And none of those things that we talked about that he cannot be demonstrate the true gospel. Otherwise, if he is not leading and loving his wife as Christ does the church, he is presenting a false gospel to the watching world. The false teacher then. That's how heavy it is. In your own marriage, if you're not acting like Christ in the way that you treat your wife, you're presenting a different Christ. You're just as guilty as the other false teachers out there. A godly leader is one who loves his wife as Christ loves the church. And this is what a one-woman man looks like. We see this in Ephesians 5:22-33, and we've talked about this before. Loving your wife with a sacrificial love, giving up yourself for what's best for her. Goes to the next part, the next attribute of love, loving your wife, which is the most important thing that you can do for your wife, is loving them in a sanctifying way, as Christ did the church. Meaning giving yourself up for what's best for her, to have a relationship with Christ. So you better do that well. And with this sanctifying love means then to help her put away all and any sin and any encumbrances that are slowing down, and being careful not to cause her to stumble. These are all things that have to be seen in your marriage to be a godly leader, to show that you're a godly leader. He's also to love her in a sensitive love, as the weaker vessel, as Peter would say, being patient, loving, kind, and encouraging to your wife. Do you think Christ treats us that way? Are we the weaker vessel? Yes. So you have to demonstrate Christ in your marriage. And finally, a secure love is what Paul commands in Ephesians 5:22-33. A secure love means treating her as the one flesh that God intended for you to have with her, that no man can separate, including you. All these seen Ephesians 5:25-33, and also 1 Peter 3, especially verse 7. And so we see this then included in a godly leader's sexuality. You know this part has to be there. It's the part that's not mentioned, but it's the part that's there, and you can't get out of it. And everybody here knows it, including the younger ones that are just the children, the teenagers, the ones that are unmarried. What this means is we have to address the issue of an unmarried man and his sexual integrity. It has to be part of this conversation too. And with this, just because a man isn't married, his sexuality is just as potentially dangerous to himself, others, and especially the name of Christ. So we don't, he's an unmarried guy, which means he doesn't have these same things. So he won't stumble, and we can trust him. All these other things that, no. Paul deals with the issue of an unmarried man, and it's very easy to understand this. First of all, it's easy for people to get duped by an unmarried man because he seems like he's not interested in that whole sex thing. So it's easy to get duped by a guy like that. But what Paul is saying here, and we see this in 1 Corinthians 7, he writes this: "It is good for a man not to touch a woman, but because of immorality, each man is to have his own wife." 1 Corinthians 7:1. What does that mean? It's this: because the natural man will have a sex drive and therefore should get married, is what Paul is saying. And every man in this room, whether they want to admit it or not, knows it's true. Every man knows this. However, I don't think there's too many of us that know this, because there's only a few. Paul talks about 1 Corinthians 7:7, who are like Paul, and they're gifted in what's called the gift of celibacy. Therefore, they don't have that drive. And we know that Paul said that he didn't have that drive, and we know that there's some. So we know that there's some. But overall, a single guy doesn't automatically mean that he's safe. We have to pay attention to those things. Therefore, with this, overall, sexual immorality is a great temptation for most men. That's what you have to remember here. And with this, failure in this area means that this reproach never goes away, and therefore disqualifies a man from any future church leadership. What does that mean? The reproach, it's the stuff on your shirt that everybody knows what happened. It never goes away. Proverbs 6:32 and 33 says this: "The one who commits adultery with a woman is lacking a heart of wisdom." We know what that means. "He who would destroy his soul does it." Listen to this part. "Wounds and disgrace he will find, and his reproach will not be blotted out." He will always be that guy, is what my words and comments to this. He will always be that guy. It will never go away when a godly leader, supposed godly leader, especially if a church falls, he'll always be known as that guy. Nobody's going to be able to trust him. Even if he's repented, that's great. But we see this, though. Paul is warning us about this. 1 Corinthians 9:27. Paul was very aware of this terrifying issue. Not necessarily the sin of sexual immorality, but any sin that would cause him to be disqualified. He even says this. Paul says this, "But I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified." A godly man doesn't just get there and think he's all that. It's ongoing maintenance of making sure that you're not disqualified. You've never arrived, even Paul the Apostle. So Paul the Apostle says, I need to be careful so that I'm not disqualified. It means every single man needs to be concerned about this. With this, getting back to the issue of sexuality in itself, it can have the greatest destruction on a ministry. And even the appearance of evil is deadly. Even if you're not guilty, the appearance of being guilty. And you guys have heard this before, and I'm going to say this. Therefore, men, don't be the guy in the kitchen. And for everybody that hasn't heard this before, what that means is at a church fellowship, for example, and all the chips and dips and all the other goodies are in the kitchen, and you go in and refill your plate for the 9th time, and there's women there, and you engage, and after a few minutes, you realize you're the only guy there, and the rest of the guys are out in the garage or the patio or wherever. It means that don't be known as the guy that enjoys hanging out with the women more than the men. Don't be the guy in the kitchen, and don't let your wives hang out with the guy in the kitchen. Watch out for that guy. That's the appearance of evil. That's the appearance of evil. That guy's known as he's not a man's man. He's always hanging out with the lady. Nobody's caught him with anything. Nobody has any... We can't find him guilty yet. We haven't followed him around enough or whatever. The bottom line is it's the appearance of evil. Don't be the guy in the kitchen. And with this, getting back to pastoral things that have to do with so-called ministry issues beyond even eating at potlucks, don't counsel women alone, especially regarding marriage issues. Why do we have a Titus 2 ministry? Why do we talk about this all the time? Because the older women are trained on how to teach the younger women and counseling them on issues of how to love their husbands and their children. It's not up to the men. Watch out for that guy. Don't be that guy. Don't let your wives hang out with that guy. You have to be so careful with these things. So therefore, a godly leader must be above reproach with his sexuality in check. Big deal. Paul lists it first. Big deal. Then he gets into 6b. Verse 6b, a godly leader's family is another qualification. What does his family look like? It says here, having faithful children who are not accused of dissipation or rebellious. Okay, well, we're going to look at that. First of all, the first statement is modeled by the second. The first statement in this passage is modeled by the second. Having faithful children, what does that look like? It looks like children that are not accused of dissipation or rebellion. And having faithful children, then, is the translation in this Bible here, the Legacy Standard Bible. And this phrase in the Greek can have two meanings, because we have Bibles in this room, I'm assuming, that have explain and show that we have two different meanings. And mean like all kinds of other words, we have to look and see what the meaning is according to the context. So in this case, the word in the Greek means faithful. Pistos is the word in the Greek. It means faithful on one hand. On the other hand, it means a believer, one who believes, one who has saving faith. In the New Testament, it is used in both contexts. Ephesians 1:1, 1 Peter 1:21, Acts 16:1, it's talking about a believer, one who believes. The same exact term also means one who is faithful, means that they're trustworthy, which means they're stable. You can count on them. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a Christian. Luke 12:42, Luke 16:11, 1 Corinthians 7:25, and even Titus 3:8. that we see that this term could go one way or the other. They all work together. Eventually, what that means is that a believer should be faithful. But with this, the English version either translates the term of one of two ways. And with this, there's conflict then about the qualifications of an elder or deacon. So what does this exactly mean? We have to get to the bottom of it. We have to see. Now, there's been very well-respected pastors who teach the truth, who have taken the position that the term means believer or Christian. And their attitude then is that if a man cannot lead his family to Christ and save his children, how can he save people in the church and lead them to Christ? Let's do the math for a minute. That makes a lot of sense. How can he, if his children aren't Christians, how can he lead other people that come in the church to become Christians? But we have to look at the context of all this. And we have to look in what's called the immediate context. And we go from the immediate context in hermeneutics and interpreting the Bible. We go from the immediate context, go out to the next step of the context, and we move out to the whole context of the whole Bible. That's how we interpret the Bible. The Bible interprets the Bible. That way there is no conflict in the Bible, and we can work it out. So that's what we're going to do. With this, then, we read earlier is, and we're going to talk about the next to immediate, or the second stage from immediate context first. We read this earlier, 1 Timothy 3:4. We see the context, and we also see the biblical doctrine of salvation. And with this, as I'll show, it leads to the interpretation of having faithful children, meaning stable, trustworthy children that you can count on to behave. And we're going to see that, okay? So with this, the Bible's doctrine of salvation makes it clear that with predestination, salvation is up to God and not man. He has written names in the Lamb's Book of Life before we were ever even a father. God is the one that chooses, and we know that. We understand this. Ezekiel chapter 18, the whole chapter makes it clear that a man is not responsible for the sin of his children, nor are the children responsible for the sin of their fathers. Now we know, along with that the father's sin can put great consequences on his children, even for generations. We know that. The Bible teaches us that, and we already know that. But a father is not responsible for his child's salvation if we actually hold to what the Bible says about predestination and election. Therefore, we can see that a man cannot be held responsible for the salvation of somebody else, according to the doctrine of election and predestinations, which we hold to because that's what the Bible teaches. That these names were written in before the foundation of the world, Revelation 13:8 and 17:8. With this, a man cannot make his children believers, nor anyone in his congregation. That's the outside whole teaching of the Bible. As we get a little closer, Paul's parallel passage we read earlier, 1 Timothy 3, says this about the same issue. He's talking about a godly man as one leading his own household well, having his children in submission with all dignity. So Paul's parallel passage and the same points of qualification for an elder describes even more of what this looks like. Faithful meaning what he says, having children in submission with all dignity. And he goes on to say this: but if a man does not know how to lead his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? So we can see then that we're talking about how he manages what's going on in his home. And then the context of this passage, the immediate context we're going to look at, is where Paul adds the description, and I said this before, what these faithful children would look like. It says, those who are not accused of dissipation or rebellious. Okay, so this is what he's talking about in the term that he's using of pistos, which is showing how faithful and trustworthy someone is. And with this, In this context, the immediate, the secondary context of what Paul's saying in the same parallel passage in 1 Timothy 3 and the entire Bible, we can see that this means children who are faithful, trustworthy, and stable, even if they're not saved. And because I'll give you a little bit of a hint, there's going to be people in the church that aren't saved either. There's going to be people in the church that bring in problems in the church that need to be dealt with. There's people that are saved in the church that might bring up problems and temporarily in sin that need to be dealt with. And that's what's going to happen in a man's house. And that's what we see here. That's the context. And he's describing what he means by faithful children. He says, they're those not accused of dissipation or rebellious. So let's go through those terms because it talks about controlling their behavior. It doesn't mean changing their heart because we know they must be born again. God changes his heart. But how do you handle those in your stewardship that are in sin, whether they're believers or not believers? How do you, as a leader, deal with it? Because you're going to deal with it in the church. So, dissipation means this. Peter describes it as sensuality, lusts, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. This is 1 Peter 4:3. That's what dissipation means. And this is the same behavior we saw in the prodigal son in Luke 15:11 through 32, including being reckless and wasteful. You look at what the prodigal son demonstrated. He demonstrated dissipation. And where did he demonstrate the dissipation? Outside the home. Just a key. He left. Remember? He was outside the home. He went and did it over there. He was no longer part of the home. He had separated himself from the home. His father, you remember the story. With this, a godly man's children should not be accused of dissipation nor rebellion. Now, you think about this for a minute. Children and drunkenness, they just don't seem to go hand in hand. What does that mean? Well, it means we all have so-called children, and they're big boys now, or big girls now, and they're not little children anymore, but they're our children, and they might be involved in such things. Because most of you sitting here, especially as we're looking at them, and the kids are going, "Well, Daddy, don't worry, because I'm not involved in drinking parties or drinking." And my point is, it has to do with what's going on in your household and those that are yours, and we can see that. So that's dissipation. Rebellion is the refusal to submit. The refusal to submit, meaning disobedient overall, yet in this context, especially to their parents. It starts with their parents. If you don't obey your parents, then you're probably not going to obey the police or the teacher or anybody else. And I'm sure the teachers could attest to that. Paul describes these people as going to this extreme, these out-of-control, rebellious children. 1 Timothy 1:9. And like I said, it's interesting that we have a teacher here who has seen that these things, if they were dealt with in the home, the teacher wouldn't have to deal with these things, and they get ugly. This is how Paul describes how ugly it can get. Those who kill their fathers or mothers, murderers, sexually immoral persons, homosexuals, kidnappers, liars. Wow, that's in there with all these? Yes, because lying is super important. Perjurers, and whatever is contrary to sound teaching. 1 Timothy 1:9 and 10. With this, a godly leader's children should not be accused of these things. And like I said, while the world would say that most children are generally not at such a high level of dissipation or rebellion, but we know that this is quite often seen in homes where adult children are still living. There's no age on what children are. It has to do with what's going on in your realm, your stewardship, your home. Like I said, the prodigal son did these things, and he was outside of his home. He wasn't in his home. He was gone. But what's going on in your shop, your area, your classroom? These are the things we're talking about. With this, the Lord had already commanded to rid a household of such sin with the utmost of consequences. Jesus maintained this from the Old Testament. Jesus maintained this from the Old Testament, Matthew 15:4. For God said, honor your father and mother, and who speaks evil of a father or mother is to be put to death. Jesus said that? Yeah, where did he quote it from? It was from the Old Testament. It was from Leviticus 20, verse 9. It still stands, the attitude of sin in the household, dishonoring of parents in the household. We had a whole sermon on this in Ephesians chapter 6. With this, and you've heard this, and I'm going to read it again, it's a reminder how God views this rebellion, and see how this rebellion listed here goes right along with dissipation and rebellion. You see this. Moses had described the tragic extent of the seriousness of a father's duties in dealing with such dissipation and rebellion with his children that were in his household, and what Moses commanded, showing not necessarily that we are commanded to do this now because we're not under the Mosaic law, but we can see God's attitude about it, and it's heavy. You've heard this, Deuteronomy chapter 21. If any man has a stubborn and rebellious son, did we just hear the word rebellious? Who will not obey his father or mother, and when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them. Okay, we see what that's all about, the rebellious part. Then the father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of the city at the gateway of his hometown, and they shall say to the elders of the city, verse 20. Well, what is he guilty of? Well, first of all, you'll see, but is guilty of those two things. This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. What did he do? What does he do? He will not obey us. He's a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death. So you shall remove the evil from your midst, and all of Israel will hear of it in fear. You shall rid the evil from your midst. This is the command for the nation of Israel, and it's the command, what I just said, that Jesus talks about, of your own home. Rid your home of the evil. This is heavy, but the Lord talks about this, and he holds the father responsible for what goes on in his home. What did I say at the beginning of this? The men are going to be shaking in their boots because this is hard. It's painful. And I also said that the women always need to hear these things too. Like, this is what my husband's going through, and this is what he's held to. And I don't really like that. It's hard. Well, yes, it is hard. But we're all uncomfortable in this situation. Our flesh looks at this and it's very difficult. So what do we want to do? Do I want to be relevant to what the world says we should be talking about? Or do we want to get down to business and see what God's talking about? This is just the bottom line, and this is what we're doing here. The godly leader will react in moving sin from within his stewardship to the extent necessary as outlined by the Lord. It means whatever it takes. God had said, I hate it so bad that it might mean putting him to death. Well, we're not commanded to take it to that point, but we can take it pretty far at removing it from our midst. This is what the Lord says. Yet, in all this, a godly leader should be proactive in raising his children in a godly manner to hopefully avoid such a horrible thing. See, godly leaders don't just wait there and wait there and wait there and wait there and wait there. And like I talked about a few months ago, do you want to be the guy that takes your son out there and everybody knows because you failed and you were not proactive? Do you want to be the woman that knows that your husband was trying to do the best he could and you blocked him? You want to be that woman? Or do you want to be the man that goes out there and says, man, this really hurts, I want to throw up, I'm miserable, but I know I did what I was supposed to do, and even if I failed in some areas, my intention was to serve the Lord, and this is hard, but at least I know that I have a clean conscience. And then to be the wife that says, my husband did the best that he could, and I tried to support him, and it's really hard, but I'm not guilty. You have a choice of which parents you're going to be by the time the dust settles. And that's the choice that everybody in this room has, and this is the choice that pastors and elders have too, how they're going to deal with things. So let's look at the proactively part, because we don't want to even deal with that. Let's deal with the proactive part. He should be proactively raising his children in a godly manner to avoid these things. Paul gives us instruction because it's the Bible. The Bible gives us instructions. Ephesians 6:4 says this, Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. It first means do not provoke your children to anger. It means don't be picking on them and beating them up over some of your personal preferences because you want to be a bully. Because you finally got some authority in your life and you think that you can finally make somebody else feel miserable since you've been picked on your whole life and everybody stole your milk money. That's not what we're talking about. Anger or exasperating means that you're making them follow all these ridiculous rules and you have no patience or love towards them. That's what this means. It means providing spiritual encouragement with prayer for your children. Once again, that's what the leaders in the church are supposed to do. 1 Thessalonians 2:8, we see that in 2:7-8, Paul and the men that were with him, that's how he treated the Thessalonians. Secondly, a father must bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord, it says. And this means teaching, this is instruction, both verbally and by example. It's not like just do as I say but not as I do. It's like you have to have integrity. Or the second your kids, especially your young men, get out, man, they're going to be done with you if you have no integrity. This is what he's talking about. And same with your daughters. And that means teaching both verbally and by example. Well, we have men right now that are teaching their kids verbally by having their children even sit here. And then whatever comments they make on the way home or when they get home or during the week, that's the way it should be done. We're trying to practice that here. Then, in the discipline and instruction of the Lord, discipline which includes, as we know, as Christians and as children, it could be painful physical discipline, not withholding the rod. And what's the rod? It's the thing that hurts really bad when you get whacked with it. That's just the easiest way. Proverbs 10:13, 14:3, just all throughout Proverbs, it means it hurts. Discipline hurts. And Hebrews 12 talks about it, verse 4-11, and how this pain is based in love. And it's going to hurt. Therefore, this leadership in the home is directly related to leadership in the church. And this is what he said again. If a man does not know how to lead his own household well, how would he take care of the church of God? It's a matter of saying, I already can see what that guy's doing. We already see what he's doing. We already can see that he's qualified. We've been watching him for years. We can see these things. He's already doing this. All the guys are going to him and saying, hey, how do you do this? How do you handle this? And with this, it's the same job. A godly leader is concerned about complete salvation for his family and for people in his church. Therefore, encouraging godliness and dealing with sin for the reasons of what's best for the person, what's the glory of God, and what's best for everyone around them. It's good for everyone and it glorifies God. It's just hard. It's just hard for everybody in this room. It's hard for. It's hard for everybody in this room. And I have some keys for some success in these areas. And it starts in the home. Love them, teach them, discipline them, pray for them, hold them accountable, build them up, and be an example to them. This is the key to godly leadership. Titus 1:5 and 6 lists then these 3 pastor qualifications so far that will help you to recognize a godly leader, follow a godly leader, and or become a godly leader. And we see that the first one is the godly leader's reputation. He means he needs to be above reproach, blameless, no accusations against him that have any validity. A godly leader's sexuality, it must be according to God's standard for marriage. Godly leader's family needs to be under control. And we see that it's hard. Everybody in this room, everybody, men, women, and children know this whole process is hard and uncomfortable. And here you're sitting here once again on a Sunday hearing what the Bible has to say because you know it's true even if it hurts. And I'm up here with you. We're all in this together. Paul says this, 1 Timothy 3:1, we read it earlier. It's a trustworthy saying. If any man aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a good work. It's a good thing. It's really anything good is hard. With this, selecting elders is serious business and too sticky for most people, is what the Bible teaches. But these qualifications are necessary for all Christian men to strive towards, and they should also be sought by women as they vet a potential husband, or as a woman sees a man that might be interested in their daughter. All these things are important for everybody in this room to know. With this, may we all understand these qualifications, that we can all recognize a godly leader, follow a godly leader, and or be one. Let's pray.